Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Northwest Craftsman. If you watched my last episode, you will remember me saying at the end, alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it there because the rest of the project is really just me applying the stain and the finish to it, and that's really pretty boring overall in the scheme of things. Yeah, well, it wasn't like that at all. The staining actually was the hardest part of this entire project. Mechanically, everything worked out totally fine. It was easy to get everything shaped right. It was everything sized right. Even installing the hardware, totally fine. Staining this thing was an absolute bear. And so I want to show you guys how not to make the same mistakes that I did and how to properly color match pieces from one to the next. Okay, here we go. So a lot of the time when you're trying to stain or color match, your raw wood looks nothing like the final product. As you can see here, I've got raw pine on the left and the leg that I'm trying to match on the right. Now what you're going to need to do is use your different test processes all the way through and continue to compare it against the final product to see which one works. On this test piece, I have three different preparation methods. On the left right now on the right, I had a wood glue water mixture. In the middle was the bare wood, and on the left was a professional Varathane pre-stain mix. This one I did the exact same thing, except I used a gel stain instead of a traditional stain. After comparing all of the different test pieces and all of the different coatings, I decided that the best one was going to be the original stain with the Varathane pre-stain. In this step, I'm applying the pre-stain. Now, it's kind of important to note that pre-stain is not used on all woods, but in this case, it is being used because I'm using pine as my replacement. The purpose of pre-stain is to help seal the wood so that stain absorbs more evenly, and pine is notorious for unevenly absorbing stain because of the early wood and late wood gradations. You can see on this piece, the lighter wood is the early wood, which is softer, more porous, and will absorb more stain, which will be darker in the end, whereas the dark pieces that you see here are the late wood, which are more dense and absorb less stain. You get what is known as grain reversal when you don't seal the wood because the dark late wood is going to show up light, where the soft light wood is going to show up dark after the stain has been applied. One of the issues that I think I ran into in this stage is that I applied it vertically, which allowed it to drip down the side and pool at the bottom. I don't know if this was necessarily the cause of my bad staining in the end, but it definitely wasn't great. Ideally, with enough patience and time, you would apply it to one side at a time, leaving that face vertical so that it can absorb more evenly across the surface. Something else you want to keep in mind when you're using your pre-stain is what type of finish you're going to be using in the end. If you have an oil-based finish, you really should be using an oil-based pre-stain or making sure that you give your part plenty of time for the water to entirely evaporate. Otherwise, you're going to get beating up of your oil on top of the water-based stain. Once you've let the pre-stain sit for the recommended amount of time, you want to go ahead and wipe off any of the excess. You really want to make sure that you're following the directions on the can, specifically because different brands and different types of pre-stain have different applications instructions. I also apologize for the background noise that you guys are hearing. It is the rainy season here in Oregon and I'm working under a metal roof. The stain that I chose for this project is more of a traditional stain, which is oil-based and is very runny, similar to water. There are really three different primary types of stains. You've got water-based, oil-based, and gel, which from what I can see are generally oil-based, they're just much thicker than the traditional stains. Regardless of the stain that you're using, something that is universal is that you need to make sure that you mix them so that they're homogeneous. These liquid stains that you see here usually have sediment on the bottom, which are the pigments and other things that they're using to actually color. With gels, you get something that looks like a jello mixture at the beginning that you need to have as a homogeneous, creamy mixture before you apply it to the part. As with the pre-stain, one of the areas that I think I went wrong when staining this project is that I did this one vertically as well, which allowed the stain to drip all the way down to the bottom and pool up there. If using a traditional stain, I would recommend that you do one face at a time and make sure that it's facing vertically so that you get as much even staining across the surface as possible. During this time, I had to continue to apply new stain to keep the surface wet so that it wasn't drying. Again, I think this was due to the fact that I was applying the stain vertically rather than horizontally. At first glance, I was really impressed with how this was turning out. The stain looked like it was being applied very evenly all the way around. However, like not counting your chickens before they hatch, stains can be kind of deceiving this way. Much to my horror, as I started to wipe this off, the stain was not evenly applied. There were some spots that were still raw like the original pine, and it was kind of like pinpricked all the way through the softwood, where the stain absorbed in some places but not others. And then what felt like almost a taunt, on this side everything absorbed fairly evenly except on that one stripe on the corner.
Needless to say, I was pretty disappointed because these results did not match what I had seen on my test pieces at all. At this point, I had a few theories for what might be happening and a few possible courses of action to move forward. My thought was that the pre-stain that I was using maybe went on too thick and was keeping the stain from coming into the softwood, and so I needed to use less pre-stain than I did previously. Wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do this, but it was one of the options that I had. As well, I also realized that the complexity of the grain structure when you're trying to stain all four sides, especially with a curved face that goes from face grain closer to end grain, presents some challenges because you've got pretty dense wood up on the face coming all the way down into pretty porous wood on the end grain. And so it's not really easy to try and make this an even absorption all the way across that face, like you can see on the left. The last flaw that I realized is that when I was using my test piece, it only ever tested one of the faces, which I believe matches the face closest to us right now. It is pretty even, you don't get a lot of differences in the grain, but that does not match what happened on the other four faces. I highly recommend that if you have a test piece that can test all four faces, I would do that so that you can see the differences in how the grain structure behaves on those different faces. Another uniquely awful view of how that face turned out, though always not lost. Both on the can and what I had read online said that if you're able to apply a second coat of stain after this one had full time to cure, you should be able to get a darker coat on it. So here is my second attempt so that I could try to get the stain to penetrate the areas where it had not previously, and maybe, just maybe, it would be more uniform. In this application, I thought about putting it on its side like I had recommended earlier so that the stain had more time on all of the different faces to soak in. As I started wiping away the stain, the first face looked great, although this was also the darkest one to start with. However, once I moved over to the other face, the same issue appeared. It was a little bit more pinpricked, but it was still uneven all the way across. And somewhat unnoticed the first time, this other face grain face barely absorbed any of the stain regardless of what I did. Just to compare them to the original piece to see if they really were as awful as they felt, here's the first face, pretty great. Second face, that's pretty awful. Third face, it barely absorbed any of the stain and looks pretty different. Last face, half of it's right, but the other half is not. So back to the drawing board about what to do next. I mean, I was getting pretty close to just remaking a new one, so there's not much that I could do to wreck this one at this point. I tried seeing if I could break through any of the pre-stain and open up any of the grains by sanding it, but the only success that came out of that was thoroughly clogging my sandpaper. In somewhat of a last-ditch effort, after many hours of work, I tried to switch stains entirely to a gel stain that was darker than the original one. I had read a couple of different things about gel stains, one being that they are usually good without preconditioner because they sit more on top of the wood, but two, they can continue to get darker with added coats over time because they're pigment-based. This was primarily what I was interested in because I just needed to get things darker across the surface of it so that it was a little bit more uniform and darker, not like the raw pine. You can see here the vast difference in texture between the previous stain and this one. I've already mixed this one up so it went from the jello consistency to a pudding consistency, and so I just had to get it back to that homogeneous texture. One of the other primary benefits to a gel stain is that it can be applied to vertical surfaces because it doesn't run, it just sticks in place. So if you have a piece of furniture that you need to stain, gel stain is definitely the way to go because it will just stick to the side, as you'll see here. Now because a gel stain is like pudding, it's kind of hard to pour out of the can, so I decided just to scoop it out, which ended up working really well, and I will probably continue to do this in the future. And then when you're trying to spread it, there's really nothing fancy about it. You just spread it across with the same foam brush that you're using in all the other different places. Get it nice and even and thick all the way across the top, and then get it across each one of the sides. On this side, I had too much, so then I started to spread it to the next side, to the next side, and to the next side, until all sides were evenly and thickly coated. I couldn't even see through any of this gel stain to the raw wood when I was done. After 1 hour and 43 minutes and 37 seconds, I decided I was going to take this off, and that is about 8 times the recommended time that the gel stain is supposed to stay on. But really, my next step was just to remake the part, so again, there wasn't really anything that I could do to ruin this. I totally underestimated how thick the gel stain was going to be after letting it sit for that long, and honestly, it felt like trying to remove tar. However, slowly, a beautiful piece started to emerge as I removed it from all of the different faces. I was pleasantly surprised with how even the coating turned out all the way across. You can still see some of the original staining defects on the inside, but the color was far more uniform than it used to be, and it actually matched the original piece pretty well. So here's the two side by side, and you can see that the primary difference with mine is that there's more pattern to it because you can see the grain structure. However, the color matches it in most of the different places around it. So Josh trying to use a traditional stain, 0 for 3, using a gel stain, 1 for 3, still had more losses, but the gel stain helped me to recover this really well, and I'm probably going to continue to use it on pine because it stained it so evenly even after previously staining it.
Well, thanks for joining me today, you guys. I really appreciate it. Some of the lessons that I learned when I was going through this process is that, one, try to match the wood as best as possible. So if you know that you're working with white oak before you go to it, get another piece of white oak because it's going to absorb stain in a similar manner, and also have a couple of scrap pieces that you can cut off of that with all four sides of your grain showing so that you can make sure that everything is going to show the way that you expect it to, and if you need to use any pre-stain, you can. Though on hardwoods like oak, you shouldn't really need to use that. Number two, if you're going to be using something like pine to replace, I would honestly just make a couple of them while you're in the stages of making them because it's not hard to make them when you're in the process. It's once you get to the end, it's kind of difficult. And that way, if you try something on one and it totally bombed, you have the ability to pretty quickly recover and move on to the next piece. Once you get to the staining portion, don't keep each one of them going through the same process. Save a couple so that you can start from just fresh wood to go right after sanding it. And that probably would have saved me a decent amount of headache because if I was to do this over again, I probably just would have used the gel stain. Which number three moves me into the third point. The regular stains are really interesting with pine because they absorb into all of the grain structure, like your end grain, especially on those curved surfaces where I move from face grain to more end grain. It's almost impossible for the preconditioner to work correctly, or at least in my experience, it was almost impossible for it to work correctly. And so I would go with a gel stain to start with because they're more pigment based anyways, and they sit on top of the wood, and so they're not going to soak into those soft pores. And you can see in that last little clip when I was staining it that it sits on vertical surfaces really nicely. It doesn't just continue to drip. With a regular stain, I actually had to finish it over and over and over again and keep brushing it so that it didn't just settle down to the bottom side and then just soak up the end grain. But yeah, gel stains were great. I will maybe with pine just be moving over to gel stains because they were a lot easier to apply and wipe off as well. So the fourth thing that I learned in this one is if you need to match, it may actually be more advantageous to just replace all of the components with the piece that you need to make rather than trying to replace a single component because it's going to be so much easier to try and match four things that you're doing simultaneously with exactly the same stain and exactly the same processes than it is to try and match something that has already been done at another time, at another place, with another stain, with another wood, et cetera, the list goes on. So, I was almost at the point where I was just going to contact them and say, how would you feel about me replacing all four of the feet for your love seat rather than just trying to replace one and have it match, because one will stand out quite a bit. Replace all four. And unless they've got a matching set of furniture all the way through, it's going to be a lot harder to spot the difference because you've got very good similarities between all four of them. Those are the lessons that I learned. I do still need to check with the family that, luckily they're family friends, but I do still need to check with the client to see if this is going to work for their needs. And if not, I'm probably going to go with option 4 and just remake for the feet for the love seat because it was so easy to actually just machine, rough cut these guys out and get them to the right shape and get them to the right dimensions. That was super, super easy to get that done. And then when I'm staining all of them, I can make them all look very similar to each other rather than having this contrast between one and the other. So at any rate, I hope that you guys learned something from my near failure. I really don't like getting this close to having to remake stuff. So I hope that you guys learned something that is going to save you some time in the future. If you have any further questions about what I did, go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below. And if you like the kind of content we're producing here at Northwest Craftsman, go ahead and hit the thumbs up for this video and hit the subscribe button to join our community. The community is growing just at this gigantic pace, and I'm super, super excited to have all of you guys as a part of the community. I love answering your questions, and I love interacting with you guys. So thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it if you're already subscribed to the channel, and if not, go ahead and join the community. It should be a blast. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Have a great one. Bye.